October 25, 1944. The waters off Samar Island in the Philippines. Dawn is breaking over what should have been a routine morning for the American escort carriers of Taffy 3. These small carriers, designed to provide air support for the invasion forces landing at Leyte Gulf, are going about their business with no expectation of what's about to unfold. Their destroyer escorts circle protectively, small warships with crews that have trained for submarine threats and air attacks. None of them expect to face what's coming over the horizon. But 30 miles to the north, the most powerful surface fleet Japan has left is bearing down on them at 25 knots. 4 battleships, including the mighty Yamato, the largest battleship ever built, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, 11 destroyers. This is the center force, commanded by Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita, and it's about to stumble upon what it believes is the main American carrier fleet. What happens in the next 2.5 hours will be remembered as one of the most extraordinary naval battles in history. A handful of small ships, outgunned and outmatched in every conceivable way, will make a stand that defies all logic. 2 commanders will make decisions in a span of 10 minutes that will seal the fate of their vessels and their crews, but save thousands of lives and preserve the entire invasion of the Philippines. This is the story of how desperation, courage, and impossible choices turned certain destruction into unlikely victory. To understand what happened off Samar that October morning, we need to go back several days and look at the bigger picture. The Battle of Leyte Gulf wasn't one battle, but a series of engagements spread across hundreds of miles of ocean. It would become the largest naval battle in history, involving more than 200,000 personnel and hundreds of ships from both sides. General Douglas MacArthur had made his famous promise 2 years earlier. "I shall return," he'd told the Filipino people when forced to evacuate in 1942. Now, in October 1944, he was making good on that promise. The landing at Leyte was the beginning of the liberation of the Philippines, and it was a massive operation. Hundreds of ships, thousands of aircraft, and nearly 200,000 troops were involved. The Japanese knew what was at stake. If the Philippines fell, their supply lines to the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies would be cut. Without that oil, the Japanese war machine would grind to a halt within months. They had to stop this invasion, and they were willing to commit everything they had left to do it. The Japanese plan was complex and ambitious. 3 separate fleets would converge on Leyte Gulf from different directions. Admiral Giseburo Ozawa would bring the northern force built around Japan's remaining aircraft carriers down from the north. But these carriers were largely empty, their air groups decimated by earlier battles. They were bait intended to draw away Admiral William Halsey's powerful Third Fleet. Meanwhile, 2 surface fleets would approach from the west, threading through the Philippine Islands to strike at the invasion beaches. Vice Admiral Shoji Nishimura would bring the southern force through Surigao Strait, while Vice Admiral Kurita's center force would take a longer route through San Bernardino Strait, before turning south to hit the landing areas from the north. It was an all-or-nothing gamble, and the Japanese High Command knew it. They called it Shogo, or Victory Operation. Some of the commanders involved called it something else, a one-way mission. Admiral Kurita's center force was the strongest of the 3 Japanese fleets. At its core were 4 battleships. The Yamato and her sister ship Musashi were floating fortresses, each displacing more than 70,000 tons, and armed with 9 18-inch guns, the largest naval rifles ever mounted on a warship. These guns could hurl shells weighing more than 1.5 tons over 25 miles. The explosive force of a single one of these shells hitting a ship was almost beyond comprehension. Alongside them were the battleships Nagato, Kongo, and Haruna, each formidable in their own right. The heavy cruisers included some of Japan's finest, ships with names that would be remembered in the annals of naval history: Atago, Maya, Takao, Chokai, Haguro, and Kumano. Supporting them were lighter cruisers and destroyers, all crewed by experienced sailors who knew this might be their last battle. On October 23rd, as this massive fleet entered the Palawan Passage west of the Philippines, American submarines spotted them. The submarines Darter and Dace moved in for an attack. Their torpedoes found their marks. The heavy cruisers Otago and Maya went down, taking hundreds of men with them, and Takao was badly damaged and forced to turn back. Admiral Kurita himself was in the water for a time before being rescued, but he transferred his flag to the Yamato and pressed on. The next day, October 24th, American carrier aircraft found the center force as it transited the Sibuyan Sea. Wave after wave of dive bombers and torpedo planes attacked throughout the day. The mighty Musashi absorbed an incredible punishment, hit by an estimated 19 torpedoes and 17 bombs over the course of 5 separate airstrikes. No ship had ever taken such a beating and remained afloat, but even the Musashi had limits. Late in the afternoon, she began to list heavily. By early evening, she rolled over and sank, taking half her crew of more than 2,000 men with her. Admiral Kurita, having lost 3 heavy cruisers and his most powerful battleship, turned his fleet around and headed west, apparently retreating. American reconnaissance aircraft watching from above reported that the center force was withdrawing. This intelligence would prove crucial and tragically mistaken. While the center force was being hammered in the Sibuyan Sea, the Japanese decoy plan was working perfectly. Admiral Ozawa's carriers had been spotted to the north, and Admiral Halsey, commanding the powerful Third Fleet, made a fateful decision. Believing that Kurita was retreating and that the real threat was Ozawa's carriers, Halsey took his entire fleet north to pursue them. This left San Bernardino Strait unguarded. No one had told the escort carriers of Taffy 3. Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague, known as Ziggy to his friends, commanded Taffy 3, the northernmost of 3 groups of escort carriers supporting the Leyte invasion. Sprague was an experienced naval aviator, but his command was never meant to fight a surface battle. His 6 escort carriers, the Fanshawe Bay, St. Lo, White Plains, Kalinan Bay, Kitkun Bay, and Gambier Bay, were small, slow vessels built on merchant ship hulls. They carried 30 to 35 aircraft each, but these were light planes meant for anti-submarine patrol and close air support of ground troops, not for attacking heavy warships. Protecting these carriers were 7 small warships. 3 were destroyers, the USS Johnston, USS Hole, and USS Herman. 4 were destroyer escorts, even smaller vessels, the USS Dennis, USS John C. Butler, USS Raymond, and USS Samuel B. Roberts. These little ships, the smallest of which displaced only 1,400 tons, were the only thing standing between the escort carriers and whatever threats might emerge from the sea. The destroyer escorts were affectionately known as tin cans, and for good reason. Their hulls were thin, their armor minimal. They were fast and maneuverable, armed with torpedoes and 5-inch guns, but they were never designed to fight battleships and cruisers. That would be like sending a pack of wolves against a herd of elephants. Courageous, perhaps, but seemingly futile. Commander Ernest E. Evans commanded the USS Johnston. At 46 years old, Evans was a Cherokee Native American from Oklahoma who had worked his way up through the ranks to command. He was known for his aggressive spirit and his devotion to his crew. When the Johnston had been commissioned the previous year, Evans had addressed his men with words that would prove prophetic. "This is going to be a fighting ship. I intend to go in harm's way, and anyone who doesn't want to go along had better get off right now." None of his crew had gotten off. Now, they were about to find out just how literally their captain had meant those words. The night of October 24th passed quietly for Taffy 3. Admiral Kurita's fleet, which American intelligence believed was retreating, had actually reversed course after dark and continued through San Bernardino Strait. There were no American forces watching the strait. The powerful Third Fleet was far to the north, chasing the Japanese carrier decoy force. Kurita's battered but still formidable fleet emerged into the Philippine Sea unopposed and turned south along the coast of Samar. At 6:45 in the morning on October 25th, one of Taffy 3's aircraft spotted the Japanese fleet and radioed back a report that must have seemed impossible. Battleships, cruisers, and destroyers, dozens of them just 20 miles away and closing fast. On the bridge of the Fanshawe Bay, Admiral Sprague's first reaction was disbelief. It had to be mistaken. There were no Japanese battleships anywhere near here. Halsey's Third Fleet had seen to that. But within minutes, lookouts on the carriers spotted the distinctive pagoda masts of Japanese battleships on the horizon. Then the first shells began to arrive. The Japanese had found what they thought was the main American carrier fleet. They could barely believe their luck. After all the losses they'd suffered getting here, they'd stumbled upon exactly what they'd been sent to destroy. Admiral Kurita ordered a general attack, and the entire center force charged forward, each ship racing to be the first to sink an American carrier. The shells from Yamato's 18-inch guns created geysers of water as tall as buildings when they hit the sea. The heavy cruisers added their 8-inch fire. The splashes were color-coded, different colored dyes in each ship's shells so they could observe where their shots were landing. Pink, red, green, yellow, purple, the ocean around the escort carriers erupted in a hellish rainbow of near misses. Admiral Sprague knew he was in desperate trouble. His escort carriers could make at most 18 knots. The Japanese battleships could do 25 or better, and the cruisers were even faster. He couldn't outrun them. He couldn't fight them. His carriers' aircraft weren't armed for attacking heavy ships. Within an hour, maybe less, the Japanese would be in point-blank range, and his entire task group would be annihilated. And beyond his ships were the landing beaches at Leyte, crowded with transports and supply ships, thousands of troops still coming ashore. If the Japanese broke through, the slaughter would be unimaginable. Sprague ordered his carriers to turn east, into the wind, so they could launch aircraft and to make smoke. He radioed frantically for help, broadcasting in the clear, sending out calls that anyone in the Pacific could hear. The situation was that desperate. But the nearest friendly fleet was the other Taffy groups to the south, and they had their own problems. Help, if it came at all, would be too late. That left the escorts, 7 small ships against the most powerful surface fleet Japan had left. Sprague ordered them to lay smoke and make torpedo attacks. It was a death sentence, and everyone knew it. But it was also the only chance. On the Johnston, Commander Evans had been tracking the Japanese fleet from the moment it appeared. He hadn't waited for orders. He later said he knew what had to be done the instant he saw those pagoda masts. At 7:20 in the morning, even before Admiral Sprague gave his order, Evans had already rung up full speed and turned the Johnston toward the enemy. "All hands to general quarters," the alarm sounded through the ship. "This is going to be a fight against overwhelming odds from which survival cannot be expected. We will do what damage we can." The crew of the Johnston raced to their battle stations. In the engine room, they coaxed every bit of speed they could from the turbines. On the gun mounts, crews loaded shells and prepared to fire. In the torpedo room, the 5 remaining torpedoes, all they had left after earlier actions, were armed and ready. 327 men, most of them barely out of their teens, prepared to charge 4 battleships, 6 heavy cruisers, 2 light cruisers, and 11 destroyers. Evans pointed the Johnston straight at the nearest heavy cruiser and pushed the throttle to full. The destroyer leaped forward, her bow wave rising high as she accelerated to her top speed of 35 knots. Behind her, a thick black smoke screen poured from her stacks, helping to hide the carriers. The Johnston was racing directly toward the enemy, alone, a single ship against a fleet. The Japanese spotted the charging destroyer and shifted fire. Shells began falling around the Johnston, walking toward her as the enemy gunners found the range. 8-inch shells from the heavy cruisers. 14-inch shells from the battleships. Any one of them could tear the thin-skinned destroyer in half. Evans held his course. He was closing the range at a combined speed of nearly 60 knots. In minutes he would be close enough to launch his torpedoes, but he had to get there first. The Johnston twisted and turned, Evans conning the ship from the open bridge, watching the shell splashes and steering for the gaps between them. It was like threading a needle while riding a motorcycle at 100 miles an hour. At 10,000 yards, close enough to see the enemy ships clearly with the naked eye, Evans gave the order. "Fire torpedoes!" All 5 torpedoes leaped from their tubes and sped toward the Japanese heavy cruiser Kumano, racing through the water at 50 knots. Evans immediately threw the Johnston into a hard turn, pulling away and ducking back into the smoke screen. 40 seconds after the torpedoes were away, before Evans could even see if they hit, the Johnston's luck ran out. 3 14-inch shells from the battleship Congo struck the destroyer almost simultaneously. The first hit near the stern, the explosion tearing into the aft engine room and destroying one of the ship's 2 engines. The second shell penetrated the bridge, exploding inside and killing or wounding nearly everyone there. The third struck amidships, blowing open the hull and starting fires. Commander Evans was hurled across the bridge. Shrapnel from the exploding shell tore into him, and 2 of his fingers were blown off. Blood poured down his arm. Around him, men were down, dead or dying. The bridge was a shambles filled with smoke and the smell of blood and explosives. For a moment it seemed like the Johnston was finished, but she wasn't. Below decks, damage control parties raced into action. In the remaining engine room, the crew kept the turbines running. On the gun mounts, crews that hadn't been hit continued to load and fire. The Johnston slowed, her top speed cut in half by the loss of an engine, but she was still moving, and she could still fight. Evans pulled himself up, wrapping a torn piece of cloth around his mangled hand. "Check fire control," he ordered, his voice steady despite the pain and the chaos. "Get me a status report, and somebody get the fires under control." The executive officer appeared, helping wounded men out of the ruined bridge. "Captain, you need medical attention." "Later," Evans said. "Tell me about my ship." The damage report came in quickly. 1 engine destroyed. Steering control lost from the bridge. They'd have to steer from the aft steering station. The gyro compass destroyed. 1 5-inch gun mount out of action. Casualties, many casualties. But the Johnston was still afloat, and her remaining guns could still fire. As the smoke cleared for a moment, they could see the result of their torpedo attack. The heavy cruiser Kumano had been hit, badly hit. Her bow was completely blown off, and she was turning away, out of the fight. One of the most powerful cruisers in the Japanese fleet, knocked out of action by a single destroyer's desperate charge. But there was no time to celebrate. Other Japanese cruisers were closing in on the carriers. Evans could see the Gambit Bay, closest to the enemy, taking hit after hit. She was slowing, falling behind the other carriers. The Japanese were going to catch her. "All guns engage the nearest cruiser," Evans ordered. The Johnston's remaining 5-inch guns began firing, their shells reaching out across the water. The little destroyer was so close now that she couldn't miss. Her shells smashed into the cruiser Suzuya, starting fires on her deck and forcing her to turn away. From his position in aft steering, having abandoned the shattered bridge, Evans maneuvered his crippled ship with a skill born of years of experience and desperation. He kept the Johnston between the Japanese fleet and the carriers, using every trick he knew to stay alive just a little longer, to buy just a few more minutes for the carriers to get away. While Commander Evans and the Johnston were making their lone charge, the other destroyers received Admiral Sprague's order to attack. Commander Leon Kintberger, commanding the USS Hull, acknowledged immediately and turned toward the enemy, calling to the Heermann to follow. These 2 destroyers, along with the Johnston, were the only destroyers Taffy 3 had. The other 4 ships were smaller destroyer escorts. The whole charged forward, making smoke as she went, her crew at battle stations and ready. Like the Johnston, she was hopelessly outmatched. But also like the Johnston, her crew knew what had to be done. As the whole emerged from her smoke screen, the full weight of the Japanese fleet's guns turned on her. Salvos from multiple ships bracketed the destroyer. Commander Kintberger ordered evasive maneuvers, throwing the ship from side to side, trying to avoid the incoming fire. For a time it worked. Shells landed all around the hole but didn't hit her. At 9,000 yards, Kintberger ordered the first torpedo salvo launched. 5 torpedoes raced toward the battleship Congo. Then he turned to bring his stern tubes to bear and fired his remaining 5 torpedoes at a heavy cruiser. The whole had emptied her magazines, throwing everything she had at the enemy. As she turned away, having launched her torpedoes, the Japanese gunners finally found their mark. A large caliber shell, probably from Yamato's massive 18-inch guns, struck the Hoffel near the waterline. The explosion was catastrophic. The hit destroyed the whole's forward engine room, and fire broke out immediately. The destroyer's speed dropped from 30 knots to 17 in seconds. But Kintberger kept fighting. All guns, continuous fire. The whole's 5-inch guns continued to bark, hurling shells at the Japanese cruisers. If they were going to go down, they would go down fighting. The Japanese concentrated their fire on this lone destroyer that had dared to attack them. More hits came in rapid succession. A shell knocked out one of the gun mounts. Another hit destroyed the port engine, leaving the whole dead in the water. Fires raged through the ship. The list to port increased as water poured through multiple holes in the hull. Kintberger ordered damage control teams to fight the fires and flooding, but the damage was too severe. More shells kept hitting the stationary destroyer. It was target practice now. A shell hit the bridge, killing the helmsman and wounding Kintberger and others. Another shell destroyed the aft guns. The whole was being systematically torn apart. On the Heermann, Commander Amos Hathaway watched the whole die and knew his ship was next. But he didn't hesitate. The Heermann charged forward, firing her guns and launching her torpedoes. She came so close to the Japanese battleships that some of her 5-inch shells were fired at nearly point-blank range, close enough to see faces on the enemy ships. The Heermann launched her torpedoes at the massive Yamato. The sight must have been surreal. A 2,000-ton destroyer attacking a 70,000-ton battleship, like a terrier attacking an elephant. But Admiral Kurita, watching from Yamato's bridge, saw those torpedoes in the water and ordered his flagship to turn away. The Yamato, the mightiest battleship in the world, turned and ran from a single destroyer's torpedo spread. The turn to avoid the Heermann's torpedoes took the Yamato out of the fight for nearly 10 minutes. She swung wide in a vast circle, her massive bulk requiring time and distance to maneuver. Those 10 minutes were precious, buying time for the carriers to extend their lead. But while the Heermann had saved herself for the moment, the whole was beyond saving. By 8:30, less than an hour and a half after the battle began, Commander Kintberger had no choice left. The whole was listing 40 degrees to port. Fires were out of control. Most of the guns were destroyed. The ship was settling into the water. "Abandon ship," Kintberger gave the order. It was perhaps the hardest thing a captain could say, admitting his ship was lost. The crew began going over the side, jumping into the oil-slicked water as their destroyer died beneath them. At 8:55 in the morning, the USS Hull rolled over and sank. She had been in the fight for just under 2 hours, but in that time she had launched 10 torpedoes, fired hundreds of 5-inch shells, and absorbed an estimated 40 hits from Japanese guns. More than 250 of her crew went into the water. Many wouldn't survive. But the whole had done her job. She had attacked an entire fleet, damaged multiple enemy ships, and bought precious time for the carriers to escape. Commander Kintberger, wounded and exhausted, floated in the water with his surviving crew, and watched his ship disappear beneath the waves. Around them, the battle continued to rage. While the destroyers were making their sacrificial runs, the 4 destroyer escorts received the same order: attack with torpedoes. For these smaller ships, the order was even more suicidal than it had been for the destroyers. Destroyer escorts were meant to hunt submarines and provide anti-aircraft protection. They were not built to charge battleships, but the men on these ships didn't hesitate. On the USS Samuel B. Roberts, Commander Robert Copeland read the order and knew what it meant. The Samuel B. Roberts, affectionately called the Sammy B. by her crew, was one of the smallest warships in the U.S. Navy capable of ocean warfare. She displaced only 1,400 tons. Her crew numbered just over 200 men. She carried 3 torpedoes and 2 5-inch guns. Against her were some of the most powerful warships ever built. Copeland turned to his crew. "We're going in. This will be a fight against overwhelming odds from which survival cannot be expected. The crew will go to their posts and commence firing. That is all." There was no panic, no hesitation. The crew of the Sammy B went to their stations and prepared to fight. Some of them were so young they had to stand on boxes to see over the gun mounts. The average age on the ship was 19. At full speed, the Samuel B. Roberts charged toward the Japanese fleet, following in the wake of the destroyers. She laid smoke as she went, her thin funnel pouring out a thick black screen. She twisted and turned as Japanese shells began to fall around her. The little ship felt like a toy boat in a bathtub as she raced across the churning sea. Commander Copeland brought his ship to within 5,000 yards of a heavy cruiser column before launching his 3 torpedoes. At that range, in the chaos of battle, with smoke everywhere and shells falling, it was almost point blank. The torpedoes leaped from their tubes and disappeared into the smoke. Whether they hit or not, no one on the Sammy B could tell. But they'd done what they came to do. Now came the hard part: getting away. Copeland threw the Samuel B. Roberts into a series of violent turns, trying to dodge the incoming fire. For a time it worked. The little ship's small size and nimble handling let her dance between the shell splashes. Her crew on the 5-inch guns fired as fast as they could, not expecting to do much damage, but trying to distract the enemy gunners, to make them flinch. And incredibly, it worked for a while. The Sammy B's guns hit a heavy cruiser repeatedly, starting fires on her deck. They may have been 5-inch guns against 8-inch armor, but fired fast enough and accurately enough they could still hurt. But then, like the hole before her, the Samuel B. Roberts's luck ran out. A heavy shell, probably an 8-inch from a cruiser, struck the ship aft. The explosion tore through the thin hull and detonated inside the aft engine room. Men disappeared in an instant, vaporized by the blast. The explosion tore a hole in the ship you could drive a truck through. More hits followed. A shell struck near the waterline. Flooding began. Another hit destroyed one of the gun mounts, the Samuel B. Roberts slowed as damage mounted, but her crew kept fighting. On the forward 5-inch gun, the crew had trained so hard that they could load and fire faster than any other gun crew in the Navy. Now they put that training to use, firing round after round, even as their ship was being torn apart around them. The gun crew fired so fast that the barrel overheated. Normally you'd slow down, let it cool, but there was no time for normal procedure. They kept firing until finally, inevitably, a shell jammed in the overheated barrel. The gun was out of action. The gun captain, a petty officer named Paul Henry Carr, refused to give up. With shells still falling all around, with the ship listing and fires burning, Carr and his crew began trying to clear the jammed round. If they could get it out, they could keep firing. They had more shells ready. They could still fight. But as Carr was working to clear the jam, another enemy shell struck the gun mount. The explosion threw men across the deck. When the smoke cleared, Paul Carr was down, terribly wounded, but he was still trying to load another shell into the gun. He was determined to get one more shot off. His crew tried to help him, tried to get him to medical aid, but Carr refused. "No," he said. "Leave me here. Just get the gun working." He died there, at his post, still trying to load that last shell. Throughout the Samuel B. Roberts, similar scenes played out. Men fought fires knowing their ship was sinking. Engineers stayed at their posts, even as water rose around them, keeping the engines running for just a few more minutes. Damage control parties worked until the rising water drove them topside. By 9 in the morning, Commander Copeland knew his ship was lost. The Samuel B. Roberts was dead in the water, listing heavily, fires out of control, taking on water through multiple holes. He gave the order to abandon ship. At 9:10, the USS Samuel B. Roberts, the destroyer escort that fought like a battleship, rolled over and sank. Of her crew of just over 200, nearly 90 were gone, many of them still at their posts when the ship went down. The survivors went into the water and watched their ship disappear, knowing they'd done all they could and more. The other destroyer escorts, the Dennis, John C., Butler, and Raymond, made similar attacks, launching their torpedoes and firing their guns before retreating back into the smoke. They survived, but only barely, all 3 ships damaged by Japanese fire. The courage of these small ships and their crews bought time, precious time, for the carriers to escape. Back on the Johnston, Commander Evans had watched the whole go down. He'd seen the Samuel B. Roberts make her brave charge. His own ship was badly damaged, barely able to move, but she could still fight. And there were still Japanese ships trying to get at the carriers. Evans saw a squadron of Japanese destroyers moving in, trying to get into torpedo range of the escort carriers. If those destroyers launched their torpedoes, the slow, vulnerable carriers wouldn't stand a chance. The Johnston was the only thing close enough to stop them. "Come left," Evans ordered. "Engage those destroyers with all guns." The Johnston turned, her remaining engine pushing her through the water at barely 15 knots. Her gyro compass was out, so they were steering by magnetic compass and guesswork. They had no fire control, no radar, just gun crews aiming by eye. But they opened fire on the Japanese destroyers at close range. It was a surreal moment. A crippled American destroyer, already hit more than a dozen times, attacked a squadron of fresh Japanese destroyers. The Japanese, startled by this aggressive move, turned away and launched their torpedoes at the Johnston instead of the carriers. All the torpedoes missed. The Johnston had drawn their fire and saved the carriers once again. But now the entire Japanese fleet seemed to concentrate on this one persistent destroyer that refused to die. Cruisers and battleships poured fire into the Johnston. Shells hit her again and again. The forward gun mount was destroyed. Another hit knocked out her remaining engine room. Fires raged throughout the ship. The Johnston slowed to a crawl, then stopped altogether, dead in the water. Commander Evans, his hand wrapped in a bloody bandage, his uniform torn and burned, looked around at his dying ship. They'd fought for more than 2 hours. They'd charged battleships, engaged cruisers, driven off destroyers. They'd launched 5 torpedoes and fired hundreds of shells. The Johnston had taken more than 20 major caliber hits and dozens of smaller ones. She'd lost more than half her crew. She was settling into the water, and there was nothing more he could do. "Abandon ship," Evans gave the order. He refused to leave until he was certain all the wounded had been evacuated, until every man who could be gotten off the ship had gone over the side. Only then did he jump into the oil-slicked water himself. At 9:45 in the morning, 3 hours after the battle began, the USS Johnston rolled over and sank. Commander Ernest Evans went down with his ship, last seen swimming in the water, but never found afterward. Of the Johnston's crew of 327 men, 186 died. But the ship had fulfilled her captain's promise. She had gone in harm's way, and she had fought to the end. While the small ships were dying to protect them, the escort carriers were fighting for their lives. Admiral Sprague had them running south at their maximum speed of 18 knots, but it wasn't enough. The Japanese battleships and cruisers capable of 25 knots or more were steadily closing the range. On the carriers, damage control parties fought fires and patched holes. Crews manned the single 5-inch gun each carrier had, futilely firing at battleships. The carriers' only real defense was their aircraft, and pilots were launching with whatever they had, even if it was just depth charges meant for submarines or nothing at all. Carrier pilots made dummy runs on the Japanese ships, diving at them without weapons just to distract the gunners. They flew so low that Japanese sailors could be seen ducking on the decks. Some pilots made multiple runs until their planes were so shot up they had to ditch in the ocean. Other pilots flew to Leyte and landed, begged, borrowed, or stole whatever ammunition they could find and flew back to the battle. The air attacks, combined with the smoke screens and the torpedo attacks from the small ships, created chaos in the Japanese formation. Admiral Kurita had ordered a general attack rather than a coordinated assault, so his ships were spread out, each captain maneuvering independently. The destroyers and destroyer escorts kept appearing out of the smoke, firing and launching torpedoes, forcing battleships and cruisers to turn away. Japanese ships began interfering with each other's fire, blocking each other's lines of sight. But despite everything, the Japanese were winning. They were getting closer to the carriers, and their shells were finding their marks more often. The escort carrier Gambit Bay, the slowest and closest to the enemy, was taking terrible punishment. Shells from the cruiser Chikuma and the battleship Yamato hit her repeatedly. Her flight deck was torn open. Fires burned out of control. She was slowing, falling further behind the other carriers. At 8:50 in the morning, just as the hull was sinking, the Gambit Bay's captain gave the order to abandon ship. The crew went over the side as their carrier settled into the water. At 9:07, the Gambit Bay capsized and sank. She was the only American carrier sunk by surface naval gunfire in World War II. The other carriers were damaged but still afloat. The Kalinin Bay was hit by multiple shells, but kept running. The Fanshawe Bay took 6 hits. The White Plains was near missed so many times that she was damaged by shell splashes. But they kept going, kept running, their crews refusing to give up. And then, at 9:25 in the morning, something incredible happened. The Japanese fleet turned around and sailed away. Admiral Sprague couldn't believe it. His carriers were nearly out of ammunition. His destroyers were sunk or crippled. The Japanese were within minutes of overrunning his entire task group. The landing beaches at Leyte were practically undefended, and the Japanese just turned around and left. On the Japanese flagship Yamato, Admiral Kurita was exhausted and confused. His fleet had taken a terrible beating over the past 3 days. He'd lost the Musashi, 3 heavy cruisers sunk and more damaged. Now his ships reported torpedoes in the water everywhere, aircraft attacking constantly. The Americans were putting up a much stronger defense than he'd expected. And he'd received reports, incorrect reports, that Admiral Halsey's powerful carriers were coming from the north. Kurita believed he was fighting the main American carrier fleet, not a handful of escort carriers. He thought he was facing the same carriers that had devastated his fleet the day before. He was worried about being trapped between Halsey's fleet and the carriers in front of him. His ships were scattered, their formations disrupted by the aggressive attacks from the American destroyers and the need to evade torpedoes. At 9:25, Kurita made his decision. He ordered his fleet to break off the attack and regroup to the north. He would gather his scattered forces, then look for the main American carrier fleet that he believed was somewhere nearby. It was one of the most controversial decisions of the war. Kurita had been on the verge of accomplishing exactly what the Japanese had sent him to do. Another hour, maybe less, and he would have destroyed Taffy 3 and been free to attack the landing beaches. But the ferocious defense by the American destroyers and destroyer escorts had convinced him he was facing a much stronger force than was actually there. The sacrifice of the Johnston Hole and Samuel B. Roberts had saved the entire invasion force. As the Japanese fleet sailed away, the surviving ships of Taffy III began the grim task of rescue. The water was full of men from the sunken ships, floating in life jackets, clinging to rafts and debris. Many were wounded. All were exhausted. And the ocean was full of sharks. The destroyer's Heermann and the destroyer escorts that had survived returned to pick up survivors. It was dangerous work. The Japanese might come back at any moment. Submarines could be lurking nearby, but they couldn't leave their shipmates in the water. Commander Evans's body was never found. Dozens of men from the Johnston died in the water from wounds, from exposure, from shark attacks. The survivors, when they were picked up, were in shock. Many wounded, all traumatized by what they'd been through. From the hole, Commander Kintberger and about 80 of his crew were rescued. More than 250 had gone into the water. Most didn't survive. The men from the Samuel B. Roberts fared somewhat better, with about 120 of the crew rescued, but nearly 90 had died when the ship went down or in the water afterward. And then, just when it seemed the ordeal was over, came one final blow. A Japanese kamikaze aircraft broke through the combat air patrol and dove into the escort carrier St. Lo. The plane's bomb penetrated into the carrier's hangar deck and exploded. The explosion set off the carrier's ammunition and aviation fuel. Within minutes, the St. Lo was a floating inferno. 25 minutes after being hit, she sank, taking more than 100 of her crew with her. It was a bitter ending to the battle. Taffy III had survived the surface attack, only to lose another carrier to a kamikaze. But they had survived. The invasion force at Leyte was intact. The Japanese fleet had been turned back. As news of the battle spread through the Pacific, the reaction was one of stunned disbelief. A handful of escort carriers and their escorts had fought off the most powerful surface fleet Japan had left. The destroyers and destroyer escorts had charged battleships in what should have been a suicide mission and had actually won. Admiral Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, called it one of the most gallant and heroic acts in the history of naval warfare. The Japanese themselves were amazed. After the war, Japanese officers who had been there that day spoke with respect bordering on awe about the ferocity and courage of the American destroyer sailors. But the cost had been terrible. More than 500 American sailors had died in the battle off Samar. 2 destroyers, a destroyer escort, and 2 escort carriers had been sunk. Hundreds more men had been wounded. Many of the survivors would carry physical and psychological scars for the rest of their lives. Commander Ernest Evans was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor, the first Native American in the Navy to receive it. The citation read, in part, outgunned and outmaneuvered, attacking an enemy force from which survival could not be expected. Commander Evans gallantly gave his life in the service of his country. The USS Hull's commander, Leon Kintberger, survived the battle but never forgot his ship and crew. He was awarded the Navy Cross. The survivors of the Hull later said they would have followed Kintberger into battle anywhere, at any time. They knew he'd done everything humanly possible to save them. The crew of the Samuel B. Roberts, both the survivors and the fallen, were remembered for fighting far beyond what anyone could have expected from such a small ship. Paul Henry Carr, the gun captain who died trying to fire one more round, became a symbol of the battle. Ordinary men doing extraordinary things in impossible circumstances. The battle off Samar, as it came to be known, was over by mid-morning on October 25, 1944. But its implications echoed through the rest of the war. Admiral Kurita's decision to break off the attack meant the Leyte landings succeeded. The Philippines would be liberated. Japan's supply lines were cut. The Pacific War would continue for another 9 months. But after Leyte, the outcome was inevitable. Historians have debated Kurita's decision for decades. Should he have pressed the attack? If he had, could he have destroyed the landing force at Leyte? Would it have changed the course of the war? We'll never know for certain. But what we do know is that the fierce resistance of the American destroyers and destroyer escorts played a crucial role in his decision. The men on those small ships didn't know they were changing history. They just knew they had a job to do, and they did it, even knowing it would likely cost them their lives. They bought time measured in minutes, bought it with their blood and their ships, and those minutes turned out to be enough. In the years after the war, survivors of the battle held reunions, sharing stories and memories, keeping alive the bonds forged in that desperate fight. Many of them said the same thing. They'd been terrified, of course. Who wouldn't be? But they'd also been proud to serve with such men, on such ships, in such a cause. The ships themselves were gone, resting in thousands of feet of water off the coast of Samar. But their story lived on, a testament to what courage and determination can accomplish against impossible odds. It's a story of commanders who made the hardest decisions, crews who followed them into certain death, and ships that fought far beyond what they were built to do. In those desperate hours on October 25, 1944, when everything hung in the balance, when the outcome of the entire Philippines campaign rested on what a handful of small ships could do against overwhelming force, the men of Taffy 3 didn't flinch. They charged forward, they fought with everything they had, and they didn't stop until their ships went down or the enemy fled. The Johnston, Hull, and Samuel B. Roberts were lost in a span of about 30 minutes, torn apart by shells from battleships and cruisers. But in the time they fought in the chaos and carnage of that morning battle, they accomplished what their commanders asked, and more than anyone could have expected. They stood between the Japanese fleet and the invasion force, and they didn't move. They couldn't win. They could barely survive, but they could fight. And that's what they did. That's what made the difference. Not the size of the ships or the number of guns, but the courage of the crews and the determination of their commanders. In 10 minutes, from the moment Commander Evans ordered the Johnston to charge to the moment the hull was mortally hit, the fate of the battle was decided. 2 ships were doomed in those 10 minutes, with the third to follow soon after. But the invasion force was saved. It's tempting to wonder what might have happened if those commanders had made different choices. If Evans had waited for orders instead of charging immediately, if Kentberger had tried to preserve his ship instead of pressing the attack, if Copeland had kept the Samuel B. Roberts back in a safer position. Would the outcome have been different? We can't know for certain, but we do know what they actually did. They saw what needed to be done, and they did it, knowing the cost. That's not recklessness. That's not foolishness. That's courage in its purest form, seeing the necessary thing and doing it, even when the price is everything you have. The sailors on those ships followed their commanders into battle, knowing they probably wouldn't survive. The youngest were 18, 19 years old. Many had never been in combat before. But when the order came to attack, they went to their stations and they fought. They loaded the guns and fired. They launched the torpedoes. They fought the fires and controlled the damage. They did their jobs until there was nothing left to do. And then they kept trying anyway. That's the real story of what happened off Samar. Not just what the commanders decided, but what the crews did. The gun captain who died trying to fire one more round. The engineers who stayed at their posts as water rose around them. The damage control parties who fought fires on sinking ships. The young sailors who went over the side into shark-infested waters, and then, when rescued, asked if they could go back and fight some more. These were ordinary Americans, farm boys from Iowa, factory workers from Detroit, kids from small towns whose names most people had never heard of. They'd been drafted or enlisted, trained, sent to war. They didn't ask to be heroes. They probably didn't think of themselves that way. But when the moment came, when everything was on the line, they stood and fought. Admiral Sprague, who commanded Taffy 3 and lived through the battle, later said he could never adequately describe what the men of his destroyers and destroyer escorts did that day. He said they had saved his carriers through sheer determination and courage. He said they had fought with a ferocity he'd never seen before and never expected to see again. And he said simply, no captain could ask for more. The Japanese sailors who fought against them that day came away with similar impressions. After the war, some of them spoke about the battle, about how shocked they were by the aggressive American attack. One Japanese officer said he couldn't understand why American destroyers kept coming, kept fighting, even when they were clearly doomed. It went against all naval doctrine, all common sense, but it worked. That's perhaps the most important lesson of the Battle off Samar. Sometimes courage matters more than firepower. Sometimes determination can overcome overwhelming odds. Not always, not easily, but sometimes. And when it does, when ordinary people accomplish extraordinary things, it's worth remembering and honoring. Today, the wrecks of the Johnston, Hole, and Samuel B. Roberts lie on the bottom of the Pacific Ocean more than 20,000 feet down. The pressure at that depth is enormous, the darkness complete. But in recent years, deep-sea explorers have found them, using sophisticated equipment to locate and photograph the wrecks. The images are haunting: broken hulls, scattered debris, ships that fought their last battle 80 years ago. The survivors are gone now, too, the last of them passing away in recent years. But their story remains, passed down through books and documentaries, through memorial services and museum exhibits. The Navy named new ships for some of them, a new Samuel B. Roberts, a new Hole. At the Naval Academy and at naval bases around the world, officers still study the battle off Samar, trying to understand what made it possible, trying to learn the lessons those men taught. And the lesson is simple: even if living up to it is hard, when the mission requires it, when lives depend on it, you go forward. You don't count the odds. You don't calculate your chances. You see what needs to be done and you do it. That's what Commander Evans did when he saw the Japanese fleet and charged. That's what Commander Kintberger did when he ordered the attack. That's what Commander Copeland did when he pointed the Samuel B. Roberts at a heavy cruiser and didn't look back. They didn't have time to think about being heroes. They just had time to make a choice: run or fight. They chose to fight. And because they did, because their crews followed them, because hundreds of young sailors did their duty even unto death, the invasion of the Philippines succeeded. The war moved one step closer to its end. Thousands of lives were saved. That's what one commander's hopeless gambit, multiplied by 3, accomplished in the space of about 30 minutes on a morning in October. 2 ships went down in the first 10 minutes of the desperate fighting. A third followed within the hour. But they took the battle to the enemy with such ferocity, such determination, such absolute refusal to be intimidated by impossible odds, that they changed the course of history. The Japanese fleet, the most powerful surface force they had left, turned around and sailed away. Not because they were beaten in any conventional sense, they still had overwhelming firepower, but because they'd been convinced they faced a stronger opponent than they actually did. The small ships fought like big ones. The outgunned crews fought like they had the advantage. And against all logic, against all reasonable expectation, it worked. That's the story. That's what happened on October 25, 1944, in the waters off Samar. That's why those ships and their crews deserve to be remembered, not just as a footnote in the history of World War II, not just as statistics in a larger battle, but as what they really were: ordinary people who did something extraordinary when everything depended on it. The Battle of Leyte Gulf was the largest naval battle in history. The battle off Samar was a small part of it, lasting just a few hours, involving relatively few ships compared to the hundreds engaged elsewhere. But it may have been the most important part. If the Japanese had broken through, if Kurita's fleet had reached the landing beaches, the consequences could have been catastrophic. The invasion might have failed. The war might have been prolonged. Thousands more might have died. But that didn't happen. And it didn't happen because when the moment came, when the impossible had to be attempted, a few hundred sailors on a handful of small ships made it happen. They paid a terrible price. More than half of them didn't come home, but they accomplished their mission. They saved the invasion force. They held the line. In the end, that's what courage looks like. Not the absence of fear, but the willingness to act despite it. Not superhuman strength or impossible heroics, but ordinary people doing their duty in extraordinary circumstances. Not knowing you'll succeed, but trying anyway, because the alternative is unthinkable. Commander Ernest Evans knew that when he commissioned the Johnston and told his crew it would be a fighting ship. He knew it when he saw the Japanese fleet and turned toward it instead of away. He knew it when he gave the order to charge, knowing it was probably a death sentence. And his crew knew it when they followed him. The same was true for the Hole and the Samuel B. Roberts and all the others. They knew the odds. They knew what they were facing. And they went anyway. That's the story. That's what we remember. That's what those men and those ships mean to us today, 80 years later. They remind us what's possible when courage meets necessity, when determination confronts overwhelming force, when ordinary people decide they will not yield, no matter the cost. The invasion force was saved. The Philippines were liberated. The war moved toward its conclusion. And in the cold waters off Samar, 3 small ships rest in eternal patrol. Their mission accomplished, their sacrifice honored, their story told and retold, so that we never forget what they did, and what it cost, and why it mattered. In 10 minutes, 2 ships were doomed, but thousands were saved. That's the arithmetic of sacrifice. That's the calculus of courage. And that's why 80 years later, we still remember the morning when a handful of destroyers and destroyer escorts charged into impossible odds and came away victorious, even though most of them didn't come away at all.